When Aunt Jean died, I flew home thinking I'd at least get to say goodbye. Instead, I stood in a dusty chapel and watched my family read from a will I knew she never wrote. Her land, her house, her legacy, handed off to Savannah like I never existed. I didn't even get a line, not a memory, not a name. Something inside me cracked, but I didn't scream. I watched, listened, and I planned. Because they didn't just steal land, they tried to rewrite history. Before I continue my story, where are you watching from? Hit that like and subscribe button. If you've ever been erased by your own blood, stay. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this unfolds. The storm hadn't hit yet, but the wind already carried that sharp desert tension, dry, electric, and waiting to break. I stood at the edge of the old ranch house porch, boots covered in red dust, watching my sister Savannah smile too widely as the lawyer folded up the last will and testament of Aunt Jean. I could barely hear over the rush in my ears. "And to my beloved niece Savannah," he said, "I leave the estate, including the house, the grazing lands, and all mineral rights attached." I didn't hear anything after that. There was no mention of me, not in the land, not in the letters, not even in passing. My hands were clenched at my sides, but my face didn't move. Savannah caught my eye, then turned to the crowd and raised a glass of cheap white wine. "To family," she smirked. I heard it clearly. The ones who stayed. Everyone laughed politely. I felt like I had been erased in real time. I had flown across the country for this. I was the one who used to clean Aunt Jean's feeding tubes in silence, sat with her through her last hallucinations when she thought coyotes were in the walls, the one who slept on the floor beside her hospital bed when the morphine didn't numb the pain. Savannah? She hadn't seen Jean in a year and a half, claimed she couldn't get away from her yoga studio opening. But here she was now, inheriting a ranch she hadn't stepped foot on since high school, smiling like she'd just been crowned. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. But Clay noticed. He was standing just behind me, hand on my lower back, steady like a fence post. "Don't," he whispered. "Not here." I nodded once, but my jaw had locked into something colder than anger. I walked back to the car without saying goodbye. No one followed. No one asked if I was okay. In their eyes, I had never been part of this. I was just the niece who left New Mexico for college and didn't come back. The one who abandoned the land. That's what they called it when I moved to Portland and didn't look back. I used to think distance meant peace. But standing there on the porch, knowing my name had been deleted from Jean's legacy, I realized something else. Distance just gave them time to bury me quietly. And now, they thought the land was theirs. Let them. They had no idea what Aunt Jean had told me the last time we spoke. Savannah always had the spotlight without lifting a finger. When we were kids, she'd show up late to chores, lie about finishing them, and still end up being called the Golden One by Aunt Jean. But when Aunt's health declined, it wasn't Savannah who held her hair through the vomiting spells or slept in a camping chair during hospital overnights. It was me. I left my graphic design firm in Portland and spent 9 months in the desert heat, making sure Jean didn't choke in her sleep. I cleaned feeding tubes, tracked medication logs, and kept the power on in a house that hadn't been updated since the 70s. Savannah sent flowers once, a silk arrangement with a card she hadn't even signed herself. But when local reporters came to write about the ranching family holding on to heritage, it was Savannah who posed in denim jackets beside Aunt Jean's horses, smiling for pictures she hadn't earned. "You know how she is," Jean told me once, her voice thin and raspy. "She needs the attention like air. Let her have it. But the land knows who tended it." I didn't know what she meant then, but I held on to it like a splinter I couldn't remove. Jean never told me directly that she planned to leave the ranch to me, But we had conversations. Real ones. Not about money or titles, but about responsibility. Legacy. You understand the soil, she'd said. That's what matters. I didn't ask for anything. I just stayed. I cleaned out the chicken coops, re-fenced the western border when coyotes got too close, and sat with John every sunset with tea in chipped mugs. It wasn't heroic. It was brutal, exhausting, sometimes lonely work. But it felt honest. Then one day, Savannah arrived out of nowhere in a Tesla and stayed the weekend. She brought John a diffuser and collagen vitamins, said she was reconnecting with her roots. I saw her take a photo of John while she was sleeping and post it with the caption, "Still strong, still glowing, legacy woman." 2 weeks later, Jean fell into her final decline. She couldn't swallow without help. She stopped recognizing the weather outside. Savannah didn't come back. Said she had a pressing retreat in Sedona. The night Jean passed, I was alone with her. It was quiet. No drama, no grand declarations. Just a hand squeeze and one final sentence before she slipped away. "It's yours. Don't let them ruin it." I didn't understand then how much that promise would matter, or how quickly they'd try to overwrite it. When I called the lawyer listed in her documents, the number was disconnected. When I searched the filing cabinet, the will was gone. And when I asked Savannah, she acted surprised Jean had even written one. "She was barely lucid," she said. "You're imagining things." But I knew what I'd heard. I had given Jean my time, my strength, my silence. And they were going to bury all of it like it never happened. Or so they thought. I hadn't spoken to Clay in 6 years, not since the night we'd argued outside a bar in Flagstaff over whether I was wasting my talent by staying close to family. He left for California the next day to join a historical land preservation nonprofit. I stayed behind, drowning in obligations I never asked for. But 3 days after Aunt Jean's memorial, he messaged me. "Saw the notice, heard what happened. Want to talk?" I didn't answer right away. I sat in my motel room, staring at the peeling wallpaper, wondering why my hands were still shaking. Then I called. We met at a quiet diner on Route 84, where the waitresses still wore turquoise rings and the coffee tasted like burnt earth. He looked older, sharper, more settled somehow. I felt like a coyote with its fur still matted from the dust. "They forged something," I said. "A will. The one read at the memorial. Jean never wrote it." Clay didn't blink. He sipped his coffee, eyes narrowing slightly. "Did she ever mention a land trust? Conservation easement? Anything official?" I blinked. Number just that the land was mine to protect. Clay nodded. "Then there's a record. If she did anything with the county or the state heritage board, it's public. But if it's been wiped or replaced, we'll know." I stared at him. "Why are you helping me?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "Because you helped me once. When no one else believed I was worth saving. That summer when he was unraveling after his dad died, I had let him crash in the barn. No questions, no conditions, just a mattress and silence. He never forgot." Clay leaned in and slid a manila folder across the table. "I already pulled some county filings. There's a deed transfer filed 2 days after Jean passed. Witnessed by your sister. Signed by Jean, with a shaky X. But the previous year, Jean filed a handwritten affidavit with the Historical Society stating she intended the land to remain in the family under stewardship, not for commercial sale." My stomach turned. "They want to sell?" Clay nodded. "There's oil interest. I called in a favor. They're already surveying behind the West Ridge. Savannah and Uncle Micah have it lined up for development." My jaw tightened. Jean would never allow that. Exactly, Clay said. But they're betting you'll give up. You always give up. He meant it gently. A memory, not an accusation. But something snapped in me right then. The part that always stepped aside for peace, the part that held its tongue for the sake of family, burned out. Then let's prove they were wrong to bet against me. Clay smiled, small and certain. Good. Let's dig up the truth before they bury it for good. Clay had a friend who owned a run-down old seed barn out near the state line, a weather-warped structure with a roof that wheezed every time the wind shifted. It had no insulation, no plumbing, and a dirt floor packed down like stone from years of harvests and neglect. I moved in 2 days after our meeting at the diner. There was no grand plan, just fury, memory, and a need to breathe where no one could lie to my face. We started small. Clay pulled county maps, archival plats, and soil records. I filed Freedom of Information requests. While the rest of my family believed I was back in Portland licking my wounds, I was deep in the records office combing through property archives, hunting for signatures, inconsistencies, and evidence that what Savannah and Uncle Micah had filed was a fabrication. It was slow, mind-numbing work, but I treated it like sacred labor. That land wasn't just dirt and fencing, it was Jean's story. Her hands had built it. My hands had preserved it. And I would be damned if their greed paved it over with oil rigs. In between paperwork, I worked the barn. We patched the roof with salvaged tin, installed a solar rig with leftover panels Clay got through a conservation grant, and poured reclaimed concrete to turn the floor into something solid. We weren't building a business yet, just a place, a proof of existence, a reminder that legacy isn't written in ink alone. I didn't advertise what we were doing. No social media posts, no big declarations, just steady progress. I lived with blistered hands, nights that smelled like dust and gasoline, and quiet mornings spent rereading Jean's old notes from the tin box she'd left me, notes no one else knew existed. One, in particular, stood out. If they ever try to buy their way through this land, remind them it's not for sale. It's not property. It's memory. By the 3rd month, we had filed a challenge with the county clerk to dispute the deed transfer. I submitted evidence of Jean's earlier statements and a notarized photo log showing the land surveyors setting up illegally during her final months. We weren't suing yet, but we had teeth now. While that moved through the legal system, Clay and I opened the doors of the barn to a few local kids, young teens who had aged out of foster homes but had nowhere to go. It wasn't a registered shelter yet, but it was a place to stay warm, to help with the garden we'd planted, to build something they could take pride in. One of the boys, Noah, asked me one morning, "Is this like a school?" I shook my head. "It's more like a place people come when everyone else says they don't count." He nodded, then got back to planting tomatoes. Clay said quietly later that night, "You realize you're building something bigger than just a land claim, right?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because for the first time I felt the weight of my own name returning, not through a headline or inheritance, but through soil, sweat, and silence. I wasn't just reclaiming what was stolen. I was becoming something they could never erase again. The invitation arrived in a cream-colored envelope sealed with the county's Heritage Commission stamp. "You are cordially invited to attend the New Mexico Land Legacy Ceremony honoring contributions to rural preservation." Clay raised an eyebrow when he saw it. "They think this is a victory lap." Savannah and Uncle Micah had nominated themselves for the award. According to the program, they were being recognized for protecting and maintaining historically significant family land from commercial development. The irony was so thick I could barely swallow it. But it also meant one thing: the spotlight was finally theirs, and the perfect place for it to implode. We had spent the last 6 weeks preparing the final report. Clay and I compiled every filing discrepancy, each forged witness signature, the notarization inconsistencies, and a side-by-side handwriting comparison between Jean's true documents and the fake will. But we didn't submit it quietly. We filed it the morning of the ceremony, copying every member of the Heritage Commission, local media, and the State Archive Board. Then we showed up. I wore black. No frills, no statement necklace, no speech in hand, just presence. Savannah took the stage halfway through the ceremony, wearing a desert-toned pantsuit and the same PR grin she'd used when she sold overpriced healing crystals. "This land is our family's heart," she said to the crowd. "We vowed to protect it, and we intend to honor that vow." As applause echoed off the sandstone walls of the open-air venue, the moderator stepped forward with a curious look. "Before we proceed, we've received some newly surfaced documentation regarding the Calderon estate. Please remain seated while we review this information." Murmurs rippled. A camera from a local station turned its lens toward the stage. Savannah stiffened. Micah's jaw clenched. A man in a gray suit stepped up and began reading. Per an affidavit filed in 2021, Jean Calderon stated her intention to preserve the estate under a non-commercial stewardship clause and named Isla Calderon as its sole guardian. This document was received by the Historical Society but was omitted from public record due to filing error. In contrast, the most recent deed transfer lists a witness and signature filed after John Calderon's documented time of death. The silence was suffocating. Savannah opened her mouth, but no words came out. Micah tried to stand, then thought better of it. The moderator turned. "Is Isla Calderon present?" I stood. Didn't smile, didn't gloat. Just walked forward and nodded. "I'm here." And that was it. The illusion collapsed with one sentence. The room didn't explode. It crumbled. Quietly. Efficiently. The same way they had tried to bury the truth. That evening, a journalist from Santa Fe published a piece titled, "The Woman They Tried to Erase." And for once, they got it right. Not with dramatics, not with fury, but with fact. Savannah's award was suspended. The county initiated an inquiry, and the land, my land, was no longer up for sale. It was officially registered under my stewardship. No one cheered. But the silence this time was mine. Savannah never called after the ceremony, neither did Micah. No apology, no explanations, not even one of those hollow, "let's talk" texts. They simply disappeared, retreating into whatever silence guilty people confuse for self-preservation. A week later, the county posted a formal ruling. The forged deed was invalidated, the property rights restored to my name, and the commercial contracts tied to the oil survey were terminated. The buyers pulled out quietly, like rats scurrying from a spotlight. Clay and I didn't celebrate. There were no champagne bottles, no dramatic speeches, no big "we did it" moment. We simply walked the perimeter of the ranch together that night as the wind kicked up little eddies of dust around our boots. We passed the western ridge where the first drilling markers had once stood. Now there was only the horizon, unchanged, undisturbed. A week later, I stood in front of the barn, paint flecks still on my hands, and hung the sign I'd carved myself. The Juniper Haven Project, a place for the uncounted. No press release, no influencer partnerships. Just a simple announcement posted to a local bulletin board and a quiet update to a nonprofit registry. Within a month, 3 more kids showed up. One with a garbage bag of clothes, another with nothing but a notebook and a cracked phone. They asked me nothing. I asked nothing back. We planted, built, mended. Every broken piece of fence and reclaimed board was part of something larger now. One morning, Clay handed me an envelope he'd found tucked in the last box of Jean's letters. I hadn't seen it before. It was addressed to me in her old looping script. Inside was a single sentence written in fading ink. Family isn't who names you in the will. It's who hands you the land and trusts you to protect it. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just stood there in the doorway, watching the wind tug at the edge of the roof, and felt something settle in me that had been uprooted for years. They tried to erase me. Instead, they carved out space for something I never would have claimed otherwise. I didn't return to the family. I didn't need to. I built something better. Not louder, just real. And this time, the silence around me didn't feel like exile. It felt like peace. 3 months later, the house Savannah had claimed was listed for foreclosure. The oil developers sued for breach of promise. Micah filed for bankruptcy. None of it brought me joy, but I watched it all unfold from the same porch where Jean used to sip peppermint tea, not with revenge in my chest, just certainty. Meanwhile, the Juniper Haven project received its first grant. A local carpenter donated tools. A retired teacher offered to run a reading circle on weekends. Clay taught a class on land conservation to a group of teens who'd never set foot on soil they had a stake in. One of them asked if I was ever afraid they'd come back. I said no, not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't recognize this place anymore. It had become something their greed could never shape or shatter. I still keep Jean's final note in my desk. I reread it every time I question whether I'm doing this right. And every time I do, I feel her presence. Not in the buildings or the paperwork, but in the way this land finally breathes without permission. The story didn't end with what they took. It began with what I chose to build instead. This story isn't just about land, forged wills, or quiet revenge. It's about what happens when you're erased by the very people who were supposed to honor your place in their lives. Isla's journey shows us how betrayal can come dressed in family smiles, and how silence, if used with intention, can become a weapon sharper than any shouted truth. In American culture, where legacy, inheritance, and family name often shape identity, this story dares to ask a deeper question. What happens when that legacy is stolen? Isla didn't just reclaim property, she reclaimed presence. She turned grief into stewardship, erasure into community, and betrayal into a blueprint for healing. Not through revenge fueled by rage, but by building something her betrayers could never touch. There's a powerful lesson here. You don't have to win loudly to win meaningfully. Justice isn't always about courts and confrontation. Sometimes it's the quiet fact of still standing, still building, still being you. While the ones who tried to rewrite your story watch from the sidelines, powerless. For anyone who's ever been disinherited, excluded, or cast aside, this story is a reminder that you don't need their permission to matter. You only need your own decision to begin again, with clarity, integrity, and courage. Sometimes forgiveness is self-liberation, but sometimes silence is the sharpest knife. And in that silence, we write new names, plant new roots, and build legacies that grow beyond the reach of those who tried to bury us. How to get started today. 1. Reflect on where in your life you've been erased or underestimated. Name it. 2. Start documenting your truth. Journals, voice notes, or even private video logs. 3. Reach out to one ally, even a distant one, who once saw your worth. You don't need many. Just one is enough to start. 4. Make one small step toward building something of your own. A project, a purpose, a place where you can belong on your terms. If this story made you think of someone who's been silenced or underestimated, share this video with them. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had to rebuild after being betrayed by your own family? And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this aren't just entertainment. They're reminders that even in betrayal, there's always a chance to begin again.